The morning mist clung to the valley like smoke from a dying campfire as Samuel Hayes stepped onto his weathered porch. At 67, his frame carried the weight of decades under the Montana sun, shoulders stooped just enough to suggest frailty to any casual observer. His pale gray eyes, the color of winter sky before snow, swept across his modest spread with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned long ago that survival depended on seeing what others missed. The ranch stretched across 300 acres of decent grazing land, nothing fancy by territorial standards, but honest ground that had fed his small herd of horses for the past 12 years. Samuel moved with deliberate care as he descended the porch steps, his left leg favoring an old wound that most folks assumed came from a kick from an ornery mule. The truth, like so many things about Samuel Hayes, remained buried deeper than most men cared to dig. His daily routine never varied. Check the water troughs first, then inspect the fence line along the eastern pasture where the wire had a tendency to sag. 3 horses grazed in the morning light, their coats gleaming with health despite their owner's apparent circumstances. A casual observer might wonder how a man living so simply could afford such quality animals, but visitors to the Hayes Ranch were rare enough that such questions rarely arose. Samuel's closest neighbor lived 8 miles southeast, and the town of Copper Creek lay a hard day's ride north. The isolation suited him perfectly. He had chosen this place precisely because a man could live quietly here, tend his business without interference, and keep his past where it belonged. The ranch house itself told a story of modest means and careful maintenance. 2 rooms, solid construction, with a stone fireplace that drew clean and a roof that had never leaked. Inside, the furnishings spoke of practical needs rather than comfort. A narrow bed, a rough-hewn table, shelves lined with basic supplies. But in the corner, protected by oilcloth, sat a small wooden box containing items that seemed out of place in such humble surroundings. A daguerreotype of a woman with kind eyes and dark hair. A gold wedding band, sized for delicate fingers. A pressed wildflower, its colors long faded, but its shape still perfect. Samuel paused in his morning inspection to run weathered fingers along the fence post nearest the house. 12 years ago, he had carved 2 initials into that wood with his knife. M.H. The letters had weathered but remained visible, a small memorial that no one else would understand. Martha Hayes had been gone for 12 years now, claimed by pneumonia during the worst winter the territory had seen in decades. She had never known about the life her husband lived before their marriage, and Samuel had intended to keep it that way forever. The sound of approaching riders broke the morning stillness like a gunshot. Samuel's head came up instantly, his body shifting almost imperceptibly as his weight settled onto the balls of his feet. To any observer, he might have appeared merely curious about unexpected visitors. But something deeper had awakened in those pale eyes, something that had been sleeping for over a decade. 6 men crested the ridge overlooking his valley, their horses lathered from hard riding. Even at distance, Samuel could read their character in the way they sat their saddles, the casual arrogance of their approach. These were not neighbors come calling or travelers seeking directions. These men rode with the confidence of predators who had never encountered anything capable of fighting back. Samuel remained motionless beside his fence post as the riders descended into his valley. His breathing remained steady, his expression unchanged, but his mind had already begun the calculations that had once kept him alive in a dozen different towns across 3 territories. 6 men, all armed, riding in formation rather than strung out like honest travelers would be. The lead rider, a massive man with arms like tree trunks, had the bearing of someone accustomed to taking whatever he wanted. The horses continued their descent towards Samuel's ranch house, and still he waited. Patience had always been his greatest weapon, more valuable than speed or accuracy or the reputation that had once preceded him into every saloon and sheriff's office from El Paso to Deadwood. Samuel Hayes understood that patience could kill a man just as dead as any bullet, and with considerably less noise. As the riders drew closer, Samuel could make out individual faces. Hard men, every one of them, with the lean look of wolves too long between kills. Their leader sat his horse like a man who had never been told no and lived to remember the experience. The others followed his lead with the practiced ease of a pack that had hunted together before. Samuel's hand rested casually against the fence post where Martha's initials marked the wood. 12 years of peace stretched behind him like a pleasant dream, and he could feel that tranquility beginning to slip away like morning mist before the rising sun. Some things, once disturbed, could never be put back the way they were. The lead rider called out while still 50 yards away, his voice carrying the false heartiness of a man testing for weakness. "We need water for our horses, old-timer. Hope you don't mind the company." Samuel's reply came soft and measured, carrying no further than necessary. "Water's free to any man who asks politely." The riders closed the remaining distance in silence, their eyes cataloging everything they saw. Samuel watched them assess his modest home, his small herd of quality horses, his apparent isolation and age. He could practically see the calculations forming behind their eyes, the predatory arithmetic that measured opportunity against risk and found the equation favorable. The massive leader swung down from his saddle with surprising grace for such a large man. Up close, Samuel could see the man stood at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. His face bore the kind of scars that came from years of violence, and his eyes held the flat, measuring look of a killer. "Name's Bull Morrison," the big man said, not offering his hand. "These here are my associates. We've been riding hard, and we're powerful thirsty. Hope you won't mind extending some hospitality to weary travelers." Samuel nodded once, his expression remaining neutral. "You're welcome to water your horses at the trough. There's a pump handle on the side if the level's low." But Morrison was already looking past him toward the house, his gaze lingering on the solid construction and well-maintained grounds. "Mighty fine spread you got here, old-timer. Man could do worse than a place like this. You work this land all by yourself." It wasn't really a question, and Samuel didn't treat it like one. "I manage well enough." The other 5 riders remained mounted, but Samuel noticed how they had spread themselves in a rough semicircle around him. Not close enough to seem immediately threatening, but positioned to cut off any retreat toward the house or the barn. These men had done this before. Morrison stepped closer, and Samuel caught the smell of old sweat, leather, and something else. The metallic scent that clung to men who had recently handled blood. The big man's hand rested casually on the butt of his pistol, a gesture that might seem unconscious to some, but carried clear meaning for anyone who knew how to read such signals. "You know," Morrison continued, his voice taking on a more familiar tone, "a man your age shouldn't be living out here all alone. Dangerous country. Never know what kind of trouble might ride down out of those hills." Samuel's pale eyes met Morrison's dark ones without flinching. "I've managed to avoid trouble so far." Morrison's laugh held no warmth whatsoever. "Well now, old-timer, sometimes trouble don't give a man much choice in the matter. Sometimes trouble just finds a man whether he wants it or not." Morrison's companions dismounted with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated like men who had worked together for years. Samuel watched them spread out across his yard, noting how each man positioned himself to cover a different angle. The youngest, a lean fellow with nervous eyes and quick hands, drifted toward the barn. Another, heavy-set with graying whiskers, ambled toward the corral where Samuel's 3 horses stood watching the newcomers with alert ears. The big man called to his companions without taking his eyes off Samuel. "Tex, check them horses. Might be we found ourselves some quality stock. And Willie, see what kind of supplies the old man keeps in that barn." Samuel's voice remained steady and calm. "I told you water's free. Didn't mention anything about poking around my property." Morrison's smile revealed teeth stained yellow from tobacco. "Now don't get yourself worked up, old-timer. We're just admiring your spread. Man works hard all his life. He deserves to have folks appreciate what he's built." The gray-whiskered man called Tex had reached the corral and was running experienced hands along the flank of Samuel's best horse, a sorrel gelding with distinctive white markings. "Well, I'll be damned, Bull. This here's quality breeding. Look at the chest on this one, and them legs. This animal could run all day and still have speed left for trouble." Morrison's interest sharpened visibly. "That's so. Old man, where'd you come by horses like that on a spread this size?" Samuel's reply came measured and careful. "Raised them from colts. Takes time to build good bloodlines." The nervous young man emerged from the barn carrying Samuel's rifle, an 1873 Winchester that had seen considerable use but showed signs of meticulous care. "Hey, Bull, look what I found." Clean as a whistle and loaded for bear. Morrison extended his hand toward the weapon. "Let me see that, Willie." His examination was thorough and professional. "Nice piece. Somebody's taken real good care of this rifle. Stock's worn smooth from use, but the action's clean as new money. You do much hunting, old-timer?" Samuel's pale eyes tracked the rifle's movement. "Enough to keep meat on the table. Rabbits and such, I'd imagine," Morrison said with a chuckle that his men echoed obediently. "Men your age probably can't handle the kick from serious game anymore." The remaining 3 riders had been silent during this exchange, but Samuel noted how they positioned themselves. One near the house, another by the well, the third keeping watch on the ridge they had descended. These men understood tactics, understood how to control ground and limit their target's options. Samuel filed this information away with the growing catalog of details he was accumulating about his uninvited guests. Morrison handed the Winchester back to Willie, but gestured for the young man to keep it. "Mighty hospitable of you to let us water our horses," he said to Samuel. "But we've been riding hard for days, and I'm thinking we could use more than just water. You wouldn't happen to have any food you could spare for hungry travelers?" The question carried undertones that transformed it into something closer to a demand. Samuel recognized the technique, the gradual escalation from request to expectation to requirement. He had seen it employed by men who specialized in taking what they wanted while maintaining a thin veneer of civility. "I've got beans and salt pork," Samuel said quietly. "Nothing fancy, but it'll fill your bellies." Morrison's smile widened. "Now that's real neighborly. And I don't suppose you'd have a drop of whiskey to cut the trail dust?" Samuel shook his head. "Don't drink anymore." The big man's expression darkened slightly. "Don't drink, or won't share with fellow travelers who've had a hard ride." "Don't drink," Samuel repeated, his voice carrying no more emotion than before. Tex called from the corral where he was examining the second horse. "Bull, you need to see this. This bay mare's got Spanish bloodlines. I'd stake my life on it. And this paint, look at the conformation on him. Somebody paid serious money for breeding stock like this." Morrison's attention swung back to Samuel with renewed focus. "Tex knows horses better than any man I've ridden with. Says you got expensive animals here. Makes a man wonder how a simple rancher comes by such valuable stock." Samuel's response came without hesitation. "Like I said, raise them from colts. Takes patience more than money." But Morrison was no longer listening. His gaze had moved to the house, assessing its construction, the quality of the timber, the solid stone foundation. "That's a mighty fine house for a man living alone. Big enough for a family. You got family, old-timer." Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Wife passed 12 years ago." Morrison stepped closer, close enough that Samuel could smell the man's unwashed clothes and see the cruel intelligence behind his dark eyes. "Sorry to hear that. Man gets to your age, loses his woman, must get powerful lonely out here. Nothing but empty rooms and memories." The words carried a calculated cruelty that made Samuel's hands flex slightly at his sides. But his voice remained level when he replied. "I manage." Willie had found Samuel's food supplies and was examining them with professional interest. "Got a good stock of provisions here, Bull. Beans, flour, coffee, sugar, salt pork and bacon. Even got some canned peaches. Man's been shopping regular in town." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Generous of you to share with travelers, old man. We'll take what we need and be on our way come morning." The statement wasn't a request, and Samuel understood that the time for polite pretense had ended. His voice carried a subtle change when he spoke, a cooling that transformed it from merely quiet to something approaching winter itself. "I'd prefer you move along come morning." Morrison's laugh boomed across the yard, echoed by his companions. "You'd prefer? Well, ain't that something, boys? The old-timer has preferences. Now, if you're from out west where men like Samuel Hayes once rode the territory, you know how quickly things can turn when respect gets thrown aside like an old horseshoe. Drop a comment and let me know what state or country you're listening from. I love hearing how these stories of the frontier travel across the world. Because what's coming next will show you exactly why some men earned reputations that lasted longer than their lives." Morrison's expression had hardened into something openly menacing. "Old man, I think you got things backward. You see, we've decided this is a real nice place to rest up for a few days. Good water, good grazing for our horses, plenty of supplies. And since you're living here all alone with no neighbors for miles, well, seems to me you could use the company. Tex had moved away from the corral and was examining the barn with the same professional assessment he had given the horses. Solid construction, bull. Good feed stored inside, tools in decent condition. Place like this could shelter a man real comfortable. Samuel's pale eyes moved from Morrison to each of his companions in turn, noting positions, weapons, the way they held themselves. 6 men, all armed, all experienced in violence. Under normal circumstances, overwhelming odds against a single elderly rancher. But Samuel Hayes understood better than most that circumstances were rarely as normal as they appeared. Willie had started carrying supplies from the house, piling them near the fire ring where the gang apparently planned to make camp. Coffee, flour, the canned peaches, a side of bacon. Samuel watched his winter provisions disappear with the same expression he might have reserved for watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. Morrison noticed his attention. "Don't worry about supplies, old-timer. We ain't the kind to leave a man with nothing. When we ride out, we'll leave you enough to get by. Of course, that might be a while. This is fine country, and we ain't been in fine country for some time." One of the mounted men, a thin fellow with pale eyes and a permanent sneer, spoke up for the first time. "Boss, what about them horses? Tex says they're worth good money." Morrison's gaze moved thoughtfully between Samuel and the animals in question. "Well now, that's something to consider. Men living alone don't really need 3 horses. Seems selfish, keeping that much value to yourself when there's others who could put good animals to better use." Samuel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Those horses stay where they are." The change in his tone was subtle but unmistakable, carrying undertones that made Morrison's eyes narrow. The big man took another step closer, bringing himself within arm's reach of Samuel. His hand rested openly on his gun, but now, the pretense of civility finally abandoned. "Old man," Morrison said slowly, "I think you need to understand how things work out here. We're 6 armed men in our prime, and you're one old codger with more pride than sense. Now, we can do this easy, or we can do this hard. But either way, things are going to go the way we want them to go." Samuel stood perfectly still, his weathered hands hanging loose at his sides, his pale eyes fixed on Morrison's face with unwavering attention. To any observer, he might have appeared frightened, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. But something flickered in those winter-gray eyes, something cold and distant and patient as death itself. The big man continued, his voice taking on the satisfied tone of a predator certain of its kill. "See, old-timer, way I figure it, you've been living too easy out here. Too comfortable, too safe. Time somebody taught you that safety's something a man has to earn every single day. And right now, you ain't earned nothing but whatever mercy we decide to show you." Dawn brought no comfort to Samuel Hayes. The first gray light filtering through his bedroom window revealed an emptiness that struck him like a physical blow. The silence was wrong. For 12 years, he had awakened to the soft nickering of his horses greeting the morning, the familiar sounds of animals moving in their corral, drinking from the trough, settling into their daily routines. Today, only silence stretched across his valley like a shroud. Samuel rose from his narrow bed where he had spent the night in fitful sleep, listening to the sounds of Morrison's gang settling in around his property. They had made their camp in his yard, used his supplies for their supper, watered their horses at his trough. But sometime during the darkest hours before dawn, that casual theft had transformed into something far more devastating. The corral stood empty. Samuel's 3 horses, the animals he had raised from colts, bred and trained with infinite patience, had vanished into the night along with Morrison and his men. The gate hung open, its latch cut cleanly with a knife. Hoofprints in the soft earth told the story clearly enough. 12 horses had departed his ranch in the pre-dawn darkness. 6 belonging to the gang, 3 that had belonged to him, and 3 more that would never return. The theft of the horses was merely the beginning. Samuel's front door stood ajar, hanging from one leather hinge where it had been forced. Inside, his modest home had been transformed into a scene of calculated destruction. Every drawer had been pulled from its frame and dumped. His small store of winter clothes lay scattered across the floor, cut and torn for no reason except cruel amusement. The table where he took his simple meals had been overturned, one leg split down its length. Even his few books, precious items in a land where education was rare, had been torn apart and their pages scattered like leaves after a storm. But the true violation lay deeper than mere destruction. Samuel moved through the wreckage with growing coldness, cataloging each theft with the precision of a man calculating a debt that would have to be paid in full. His winter supply of coffee, gone. The salt pork that would have seen him through the lean months, disappeared. His small store of ammunition for the Winchester, cleaned out completely. Even his spare boots and his heavy winter coat had been taken, leaving him vulnerable to the harsh Montana weather that would arrive with the first mountain snows. In the corner where he kept his personal belongings, the wooden box that held his most precious memories had been opened and rifled. Martha's daguerreotype lay cracked across the floor, the glass that had protected her image for 12 years now scattered in sharp fragments. The pressed wildflower, picked by her hands on their wedding day, had been crushed to powder and scattered with deliberate cruelty. But it was the empty space where her wedding ring had rested that stopped Samuel's heart completely. The simple gold band, sized for fingers that had been gentle and kind, had been Martha's only jewelry. Samuel had placed it in that box the day they buried her, unable to bear the sight of it on her cold hands, but equally unable to consign it to the earth. For 12 years it had rested in that corner, a tangible connection to the only peace he had ever known. Now even that small comfort had been stolen by men who understood neither its value nor the cost of taking it. On his overturned table, weighted down with an empty whiskey bottle they must have carried with them, Morrison had left a note written in crude letters across a page torn from one of Samuel's books. "Thanks for the hospitality, Grandpa. Don't follow us unless you want to join your woman in the ground. We'll take real good care of them horses." Samuel read the words twice, his pale eyes moving across each letter with the careful attention of a man memorizing something important. Then he folded the paper precisely and placed it in his shirt pocket. Some debts required documentation. The violation of his home, the theft of his animals, even the destruction of his few possessions might have been endured. Samuel Hayes had lost much in his life and learned to carry on despite loss. But the theft of Martha's ring transformed this crime into something that went beyond mere larceny. They had stolen the last tangible piece of his dead wife, the final symbol of the only happiness he had ever known. Some lines, once crossed, demanded a reckoning that transcended questions of law or mercy. Samuel made his way to the barn, stepping carefully through the debris scattered across his floor. The building's interior showed signs of hasty searching, tools scattered, feed bags cut open and spilled. But Morrison's men had been in too much hurry to conduct a thorough investigation. They had missed what they were never meant to find. In the corner where Samuel stored his heaviest tools, a section of floorboard looked identical to those around it. But when pressed in a specific sequence, it lifted to reveal a cavity excavated years before with meticulous care. Wrapped in oiled canvas, protected from moisture and time, lay the tools of a trade Samuel Hayes had abandoned 12 years ago when he buried his wife and tried to bury his past along with her. The gun belt emerged from its hiding place like something returning from the dead. Black leather, supple as the day it was made, with silver conchos that still caught the light despite years of storage. The holsters were positioned for a cross draw, angled to allow a man to reach his weapons whether mounted or standing, whether facing one opponent or many. And nestled in those holsters like sleeping serpents were the matched Colt .45 peacemakers that had earned Samuel Hayes a reputation across 3 territories. The grips bore delicate engravings, carved by his own hand during the long winter nights after he married Martha. Her initials, M.H., surrounded by tiny wildflowers that matched the ones she had loved to pick during their walks along the creek. The weapons themselves were flawless examples of the gunmaker's art, their actions smooth as water, their balance perfect for the hands that had learned to use them with surgical precision. Beneath the gun belt lay other reminders of the man Samuel Hayes had been before he became a simple rancher. A badge, tarnished but still readable, marked with the words Territorial Marshal. A folded document, signed by a territorial governor, granting him authority to pursue criminals across county and territorial boundaries. And at the bottom of the cache, yellowed with age but still legible, a wanted poster bearing his own image from 20 years past. Samuel Hayes, known as Death's Door Hayes. wanted for questioning in connection with 47 deaths across New Mexico, Colorado, and Montana territories. Approach with extreme caution. Subject is considered armed and extremely dangerous. The poster had been issued not because Samuel was wanted for murder, but because every man he had killed had been found with a single bullet wound, placed with such precision that death came instantly. Witnesses spoke of a man who could draw and fire faster than thought itself, who could place shots with accuracy that seemed supernatural. They called him Death's Door because those who faced him in gunfights found themselves knocking on death's door before they realized the fight had begun. Samuel lifted the gun belt from its resting place and felt its familiar weight settle around his hips. The leather molded itself to his body as though it had been waiting for this moment, anticipating the day when peace would prove inadequate and harder measures would be required. The transformation was immediate and profound. The stooped shoulders straightened. The hesitant step became fluid and sure. The pale eyes that had seemed tired and defeated took on the cold intensity of winter ice. For 12 years, Samuel Hayes had successfully convinced himself that the man who wore these guns was dead and buried. He had built a life of deliberate simplicity, avoiding situations that might awaken the violent skills that had once defined him. He had chosen isolation over confrontation, solitude over the company that might bring trouble to his door. He had believed, with the desperate faith of a man seeking redemption, that he could leave that violent past behind and live out his remaining years in peace. But Morrison and his men had made peace impossible. They had stolen more than horses and money and simple possessions. They had stolen Martha's ring, the one thing in this world that connected him to love instead of death. And in taking it, they had awakened something that should have been allowed to sleep forever. Samuel checked the loads in both pistols with movements so automatic they seemed like breathing. 6 shots in each weapon, 12 bullets total. He had faced worse odds with less preparation. The familiar weight of the guns against his hips felt like a homecoming he had never wanted but could no longer avoid. Morrison's trail was easy to follow. 12 horses left clear sign, and the gang had made no effort to conceal their direction of travel. They were heading southeast, toward the main trail that led to Copper Creek and the railroad beyond. Confident in their success, secure in their belief that they had robbed a helpless old man who would never dare pursue them. They were about to learn how wrong confident men could be when they underestimated the quiet ones. Samuel saddled his oldest horse, a sturdy bay that had served him faithfully for 8 years. The animal sensed the change in his master, stepping nervously as Samuel secured his gear with the economical movements of a man preparing for war. A bedroll, enough food for 3 days, ammunition for the Winchester and the Colts. Everything else was luxury he could not afford. Before mounting, Samuel returned to the wreckage of his home one final time. He found the largest fragment of Martha's broken portrait and tucked it carefully into his shirt pocket next to Morrison's mocking note. Some things deserved to be present when justice was finally served. The sun had cleared the eastern mountains by the time Samuel Hayes rode out of his valley, following the trail left by the men who had destroyed his peace. Behind him lay 12 years of quiet contentment, reduced to rubble and theft. Ahead lay a reckoning that would remind the territory why some men earned legends and others earned graves. The trail left by Morrison's gang was as clear to Samuel Hayes as words printed on paper. 12 horses moving at a steady pace. No effort made to conceal their direction or disguise their numbers. The gang leader's arrogance extended even to this basic precaution, a mistake that spoke to years of preying on victims too frightened or powerless to pursue justice. Samuel read the signs with an expertise honed across decades of frontier law enforcement. Here, where the soft earth near a creek crossing held perfect impressions, he could identify each individual horse by the distinctive patterns of their shoes. Morrison's big stallion left deep prints from a loose nail in the left rear shoe. The nervous young man called Willie rode a mare that favored her right front leg, creating a subtle asymmetry in her gait. Most telling of all were the prints left by Samuel's own stolen animals, horses whose hoof prints he knew as well as his own handwriting. The bay gelding with the white markings had always stepped slightly wide with his left front foot, a quirk that left distinctive tracks. The paint horse had been reshod just 2 weeks ago, his prints showing the sharp edges of fresh iron. And the sorrel mare, his finest animal and the one he had planned to breed come spring, left the clean, precise tracks of perfectly balanced hooves that had been shaped by Samuel's own careful attention. Following the trail required no particular skill, but reading its story demanded the kind of knowledge that separated frontier lawmen from eastern greenhorns who learned their trade from books rather than bitter experience. The gang had maintained their southeast heading through the night, following established trails rather than cutting cross-country. This suggested they were confident of their safety, unconcerned about pursuit, and likely heading toward a specific destination rather than simply fleeing in random panic. As Samuel tracked his quarry through the morning hours, memory carried him back across 25 years to another pursuit, another gang of thieves who had underestimated the reach of territorial law. He had been 32 then, newly appointed as a United States Marshal for the territory of Colorado, tasked with bringing order to mining camps where violence was as common as gambling and considerably more permanent. The Rafferty gang had been terrorizing prospectors along Clear Creek for months, robbing and killing with the casual brutality of men who believed themselves beyond the reach of justice. They had made the mistake of murdering a family traveling to Denver, killing not just the man and woman, but their 2 young children as well. The territorial governor had given Samuel a simple directive: bring them back for trial, or bring back their bodies. He had not particularly cared which option Samuel chose. The pursuit had lasted 11 days across some of the most unforgiving country in the Colorado mountains. Samuel had tracked the gang through snow, across streams, over rocky ground that would have defeated most men. He had learned to think like them, to anticipate their choices, to be waiting when they thought they had found safety. When the final confrontation came, it had been swift and definitive. 5 men faced Samuel Hayes in a canyon they had thought would provide perfect cover for an ambush. Within 60 seconds, 4 of them were dead and the 5th was dying. Samuel had brought their bodies back draped across their own horses, along with the family's stolen belongings and enough evidence to close the case permanently. That had been the beginning of his reputation as Death's Door Hayes. Word of his deadly precision had spread across the territory like wildfire, growing in the telling until fact became legend and legend became myth. Soon, wanted men would surrender rather than face him in a gunfight. Sheriffs in distant towns would send for him when local law proved inadequate. His name alone became a weapon more effective than any gun. But with that reputation had come a weariness that settled into his bones like winter cold. 23 confirmed kills in his first 5 years as a marshal, each one necessary, each one justified, each one leaving a mark on his soul that never quite healed. When he met Martha in the spring of 1869, working as a seamstress in a dusty territorial capital, she had offered him something he had never imagined possible: a reason to hang up his guns and try to become the kind of man who could sleep through the night without reaching for his weapons. The memory of Martha's gentle hands smoothing away the tension from his shoulders brought Samuel back to the present with painful clarity. Those hands were gone now, reduced to bones beneath the Montana earth, and the ring that had graced her finger was somewhere ahead of him in Morrison's pocket. The trail led steadily southeast through country that grew more populated as the morning progressed. Samuel passed 2 homesteads where smoke rose from morning cooking fires, saw cattle grazing in distant meadows, noted the increasing frequency of wheel ruts that marked established roads rather than game trails. The gang was heading towards civilization, confident that they could lose themselves among honest travelers and innocent citizens. By midday, the trail intersected with the main freight road that connected the northern mining camps to the railroad terminus at Copper Creek. Here, the tracks of Morrison's gang were joined by dozens of others: freight wagons, stagecoaches, individual riders heading to and from the railhead. But Samuel's experienced eye could still distinguish the specific hoofprints he was following, noting where they paused at a creek crossing, where they stopped to rest the horses in the shade of a cottonwood grove. The gang was moving at a leisurely pace, stopping frequently, showing no signs of urgency or concern about pursuit. This casual approach confirmed Samuel's growing understanding of their psychology. These were men who had grown comfortable with their predatory lifestyle, accustomed to victims who submitted without resistance, confident that their combination of violence and intimidation was sufficient to handle any situation they might encounter. They were about to discover the difference between intimidating helpless ranchers and facing a man who had spent decades hunting killers across the most dangerous territories in the American frontier. The way station appeared ahead like a mirage shimmering in the afternoon heat. Hannigan's Rest was a rough collection of buildings clustered around a natural spring, serving travelers on the freight road with water, food, and whiskey of questionable quality. The main building was a saloon and general store combined, with a stable for travelers' horses and a few crude rooms for those willing to pay for something approaching privacy. Samuel could see Morrison's horses in the corral before he was close enough to make out individual faces. 12 animals, including his own 3, standing in whatever shade they could find. The horses looked well-watered and fed, suggesting the gang planned an extended stay rather than a brief rest before continuing their flight. From inside the saloon came the sounds of men drinking heavily and celebrating their recent success. Samuel could hear Morrison's distinctive laugh booming above the general conversation, punctuated by the crude jokes and rough humor of men who believed themselves safely beyond the reach of consequences. Samuel approached the way station with the calculated caution of a man who understood that overconfidence killed more experienced fighters than enemy bullets. He dismounted 50 yards from the main building, securing his horse to a hitching post where the animal would have access to water but could be quickly retrieved if circumstances required a rapid departure. The gun belt around his waist felt as natural as breathing after 12 years of absence. The weight of the matched Colt's a familiar comfort that spoke to reflexes honed by decades of practice. Samuel checked his weapons one final time, ensuring that each cylinder rotated smoothly, that cartridges seated properly, that nothing would impede the lightning-fast draw that had kept him alive through countless confrontations. The interior of Hannigan's Rest was exactly what Samuel had expected. Rough wooden tables, a bar constructed from split logs, sawdust on the floor to absorb spilled drinks, and blood from the inevitable fights. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the sour smell of cheap whiskey, underscored by the unwashed odor of men who lived hard and bathed infrequently. Morrison and his 5 companions occupied a large table near the back of the room, their voices loud with liquor and the exhilaration of easy money. Samuel's stolen horses were the topic of animated discussion, along with plans for their eventual sale. The gang leader himself was holding court, regaling his men and several other patrons with an elaborately embellished version of their recent robbery. "So there's this old codger living all alone on this spread," Morrison was saying, his words slightly slurred but his voice carrying clearly across the saloon. "Must be 70 if he's a day, bent over like a question mark, shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. Got these 3 beautiful horses, prime stock, probably worth more than he's seen in ready cash his whole miserable life." The gang members laughed appreciatively while Morrison continued his tale. "Old fool tried to act tough. Told us we should move along come morning. Can you believe that? 6 armed men, and he thinks he can order us around like we're school children afraid of his wooden ruler." Willie, the nervous young man who had found Samuel's rifle, chimed in with his own version of events. "Should have seen his face when we took his precious horses. Looked like somebody told him his mama was dead. Probably crying into his pillow right now, wondering how he's going to work his little farm without animals to help him." Samuel stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior light while cataloging everything he observed. Morrison and his men were drunk but not incapacitated, armed but relaxed, confident but not particularly alert. Other patrons included 2 freight drivers, an elderly man who might have been a traveling preacher, and a well-dressed stranger who kept to himself at the far end of the bar. The bartender, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and nervous eyes, noticed Samuel's arrival with the particular attention that saloon keepers developed for potential trouble. Samuel's appearance was unremarkable enough. Dusty clothes, travel-worn hat, the general look of a man who had been riding hard. But something about his stillness, the way he stood without moving while his pale eyes surveyed the room, made experienced men take notice. Samuel walked to the bar with measured steps, his boot heels clicking against the wooden floor. The bartender approached with professional caution, clearly hoping to serve this customer quickly and avoid complications. "What'll it be, friend?" the bartender asked, his voice carrying the false heartiness of a man hoping to prevent trouble before it started. "Water for my horse," Samuel replied quietly. "And information about the men at that back table." The bartender's nervous glance toward Morrison's group confirmed what Samuel already suspected. These men had been throwing money around freely, buying drinks for the house, acting like conquering heroes celebrating a great victory. In a place like Hannigan's Rest, cash-paying customers were treated with considerable deference regardless of their obvious character. "Don't know much about them," the bartender said carefully. "Been here since morning, buying drinks, telling stories. Paid in silver coin, so I ain't complaining about their company." Samuel placed a worn silver dollar on the bar, payment for information as much as refreshment. "The horses in your corral," he said conversationally. "The sorrel mare with white markings, the paint gelding, the bay with the distinctive chest. Know anything about those animals?" The bartender's expression grew more nervous as he sensed undercurrents in this conversation that could lead to serious trouble. His gaze flicked between Samuel and the noisy table where Morrison continued entertaining his audience with exaggerated tales of conquest. "Those belong to the gentleman at the back table," he said finally. "Fine animals. They mentioned something about acquiring them from a rancher who didn't need so many horses." Morrison's voice carried clearly through the smoky air as he reached the climax of his story. "Best part was the note I left him. Told that old fool not to follow us unless he wanted to join his dead wife. Should have seen the look in his eyes when I mentioned his woman. Like somebody stuck a knife right through his heart." The laughter that followed this observation was loud and cruel, the kind of mirth that came from men who enjoyed inflicting pain on those weaker than themselves. Samuel listened to their amusement with the patient attention of a man memorizing voices he would never forget. He finished his water and turned to face the room, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Morrison's table fell silent as they became aware of the stranger's attention, their drunken celebration pausing as primitive instincts warned of potential danger. Morrison looked up from his drink with the annoyed expression of a man whose entertainment had been interrupted. His eyes traveled over Samuel's dusty clothes, weathered face, and the gun belt around his waist. What seemed to register was the appearance of just another aging drifter, probably looking for work or hoping to cadge a free drink. "Something I can do for you, old-timer?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying the casual contempt he reserved for men he considered beneath his notice. Samuel's response came quiet and measured, carrying no further than the immediate area, but somehow filling the entire saloon with its presence. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Morrison's laugh was loud and dismissive. "That's so? And what might that be?" "3 horses. A sorrel mare, a paint gelding, a bay with white markings." Samuel's pale eyes remained fixed on Morrison's face with unwavering intensity. "Also some money, and a gold wedding ring sized for a woman's finger." The saloon had grown completely silent now, the kind of hush that preceded either violence or revelation. Morrison's expression shifted from amusement to suspicion as he began to understand the implications of this confrontation. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison said slowly, rising from his chair with deliberate menace. "If it ain't the old codger himself. Boys, look what followed us all the way from his little ranch. Seems Grandpa here thinks he's some kind of hero." Samuel's voice carried the same level tone as before, but something in its quality made every man in the saloon pay attention. "I'm giving you one chance to return what you took. Walk away now, and you'll live to see tomorrow." Morrison's roar of laughter was echoed by his companions, but the sound held a forced quality that suggested uncertainty beneath their bravado. "One man, old-timer. 6 of us. You sure you got the odds figured right?" One of Morrison's men, a lean fellow with calculating eyes, had been studying Samuel more carefully than his companions. His gaze lingered on the gun belt, noting details that the others had missed in their drunken confidence. The quality of the leather, the precise positioning of the holsters, the way the weapons seemed to belong exactly where they hung. "Boss," the man said quietly, his voice carrying a note of warning. "Take a look at them guns. And them grips." Morrison glanced dismissively towards Samuel's weapons, but his expression changed as he noticed what his companion had seen. The carved initials on the pistol grips were clearly visible now, the delicate image that Samuel had engraved during the winter nights of his happiness. But it was the well-dressed stranger at the end of the bar who provided the identification that changed everything. He had been watching the confrontation with growing recognition, his educated eye noting details that the rougher patrons missed. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Dear God," he said quietly, his words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "Those are the guns of death's door, Hayes." The name fell across the saloon like a shroud, silencing even the most drunken conversations as its implications settled into the minds of men who had heard the stories. Death's door Hayes, the legend who had cleaned up 3 territories. The marshal who could place 6 shots through a silver dollar at 50 paces. The man who had faced down the Rafferty gang, the Comanchero Raiders, and a dozen other groups of killers who had thought themselves beyond the reach of justice. The well-dressed stranger at the bar continued speaking, his voice carrying the tone of a man reciting historical fact. Samuel Hayes, territorial marshal for Colorado, New Mexico, and Montana from 1867 to 1879. 47 confirmed kills, all in the line of duty. They called him Death's Door because facing him in a gunfight was like knocking on death's door and finding it wide open. Morrison's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan, but whiskey and pride fought against the growing understanding of what he faced. His men were looking between their leader and Samuel with expressions that ranged from disbelief to poorly concealed terror. Willie, the nervous young man who had ransacked Samuel's barn, was backing slowly toward the far wall, his hand shaking as he reached for his pistol. The freight drivers at their corner table had already begun moving toward the door, understanding that when legends like Death's Door Hayes came calling, innocent bystanders had a tendency to stop breathing. The elderly man who looked like a preacher was clutching a worn Bible to his chest, his lips moving in what appeared to be silent prayer. Morrison rallied his courage with a long pull from his whiskey bottle, slamming it down on the table hard enough to make the wooden surface jump. "I don't care if you're Wild Bill Hickok himself, old man. Story don't change the numbers. You're one man facing 6 armed fighters in their prime. You might have been something special 20 years ago, but today you're just another old timer who don't know when to quit." Samuel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every man in the room heard it clearly. 6-1, he said, his pale eyes never leaving Morrison's face. "I've faced worse odds. Laredo, 1881. 8 members of the Delacroix gang cornered me in a cantina much like this one. They're all buried in Boot Hill now, and I walked out without a scratch." The transformation was complete now, as if 20 years had fallen away like a discarded coat. Samuel Hayes no longer appeared to be a tired old rancher pushed beyond his limits. He stood with the balanced stillness of a man who had learned to kill efficiently and without hesitation, whose hands had drawn and fired faster than human reflexes could follow, who had faced death so often that it held no more terror than an old acquaintance. Morrison's lieutenant, the lean man who had first noticed Samuel's guns, was edging toward the door with the survival instincts of a predator recognizing a more dangerous hunter. But his movement caught Samuel's attention, and those winter-gray eyes fixed on him with the intensity of a striking hawk. "Don't," Samuel said quietly, and the single word carried such absolute authority that the man froze in mid-step. Morrison's voice cracked slightly as he tried to maintain his bravado. "You're bluffing, old man. Reputation don't mean nothing if you can't back it up anymore. Maybe you were fast once, but time catches up to everybody. Your hands probably shake too much to hit the broadside of a barn." Samuel's hands hung loose at his sides, perfectly steady, positioned exactly where they needed to be for the cross-draw that had made him legendary. To the casual observer, he appeared relaxed, almost casual. But experienced fighters recognized the stance of a man coiled like a spring, ready to explode into motion at the first sign of threat. The bartender had dropped below the level of his bar, understanding that when men like Samuel Hayes and Bull Morrison settled their differences, staying in the line of fire was a quick way to join the casualty count. The remaining patrons were pressed against the walls, as far from the center of the room as possible. Morrison's voice took on a pleading quality that his pride tried to disguise as reason. "Look, Hayes, if that's really who you are, maybe we can work something out. We got your horses, we got your money. Hell, we even got that ring you're so worried about. No reason this has to end in blood. We can make a deal." Samuel's response came with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You took something that can't be returned with money or deals. You desecrated my wife's memory, destroyed her belongings, spoke of her death like it was a joke for your amusement. Some things demand payment in blood. Morrison's face flushed red with anger and whiskey-fueled false courage. You sanctimonious old bastard. She's been dead 12 years. What difference does it make if we took her ring? Dead is dead, and sentiment don't put food on the table or money in your pocket. The words were barely out of Morrison's mouth when Willie made his move, his nerve finally breaking under the pressure of the confrontation. His hand swept toward his gun with the desperate speed of a man who knew he was facing death and hoped to strike first. He was young, he was fast, and he had the advantage of surprise. Samuel's draw was like watching lightning contained in human form. The matched Colts seemed to appear in his hands without crossing the space between holsters and firing position, as if they had simply materialized where they needed to be. The left-hand gun spoke first, its report deafening in the confined space of the saloon, and Willie's pistol flew from his hand along with two of his fingers, blood spraying across the wall behind him. The young man's scream of pain and shock was lost in the thunder of gunfire as Morrison's men realized that negotiation time had ended. Tex, the gray-whiskered horse expert, had his weapon halfway clear when Samuel's right-hand Colt put a bullet through his heart with surgical precision. The man dropped without another sound, his unfired pistol clattering to the sawdust-covered floor. The saloon erupted into chaos as the remaining gang members scattered for cover, overturning tables, diving behind the bar, scrambling for positions that might offer protection from the legendary accuracy they now faced. Morrison himself had drawn his gun but hesitated to fire, understanding on some primal level that missing his first shot would be his last mistake. Samuel moved through the confusion like a man walking through his own parlor, unhurried despite the bullets whining around him. His gun spoke in measured sequence, each shot placed with the mechanical precision that had earned his reputation. The heavy-set gang member who had examined Samuel's barn took a bullet through the shoulder that spun him around and sent his weapon flying. Another gang member, attempting to circle behind Samuel, found himself looking down the barrel of the left-hand Colt and surrendered with his hands raised high. Willie was on his knees, clutching his mangled hand and sobbing, no longer a threat to anyone. Tex lay motionless in a spreading pool of blood. The heavy-set gang member was trying to stem the flow of blood from his shoulder wound, while his companion kept his hands raised in terrified surrender. That left Morrison and two others, who had managed to reach the relative safety of the overturned tables near the back of the saloon. Morrison's voice had lost all pretense of command authority, cracking with fear as he called out from behind his improvised barricade. "Hayes, Samuel, whatever you want to call yourself. We can work this out. We got your money right here, every last dollar. And the ring, it's safe, not damaged. You can have it all back." Samuel's response came calm and measured as he reloaded both weapons with movements so practiced they seemed automatic. "Too late for that, Morrison. You had your chance to do right. You chose to mock my wife's memory instead. Some debts can only be paid one way." The remaining gang members were whispering frantically among themselves, their voices carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over the ruined saloon. One of them, a scar-faced man Samuel had noticed eyeing the horses earlier, was trying to convince Morrison to make a run for the door. The other, a young Mexican who couldn't have been more than 20, was openly weeping as he realized his life was about to end in a nameless saloon over horses and money he had never wanted to steal. Morrison's voice took on the desperate tone of a man trying to negotiate with his own execution. "Listen to me, Hayes. I got information you might want. We ain't the only ones operating in this territory. There's other gangs, bigger ones, doing worse things than taking horses from old ranchers. You let us go, we'll tell you everything we know. Help you clean up this whole region like you did down in Colorado." Samuel began walking toward their position with the steady pace of inevitability itself. "I'm not a marshal anymore, Morrison. I'm not cleaning up territories or bringing justice to the frontier. I'm just a man who wants his wife's wedding ring back." A shot rang out from behind the overturned table, Morrison's desperation finally overcoming his fear. The bullet whined past Samuel's head, close enough to disturb his hair, but not close enough to matter. Samuel's return shot was instant and precise, punching through the wooden table like it was paper and drawing a scream of pain from the man behind it. The The scar-faced gang member broke cover, sprinting toward the saloon's front door with the desperate speed of a man fleeing for his life. Samuel's right-hand gun tracked his movement with mechanical precision, but at the last second, he lowered the weapon slightly. The bullet took the man through the leg, sending him crashing to the floor, just short of freedom, but leaving him alive to spread the story of what happened when death's door haze came calling. Morrison and his last companion were trapped now, wounded and running low on ammunition, facing a man whose reputation had just been proven entirely justified. The big gang leader's voice carried a new note of genuine terror as he realized that all his years of bullying helpless victims had not prepared him for this moment. Please, Hayes. Please. I got a wife back in Kansas. Kids too. Little ones who ain't done nothing wrong. You kill me, they got nothing. They'll starve. Samuel's voice carried no emotion whatsoever, as cold and final as a tombstone inscription. Should have thought about that before you decided to make your living stealing from honest people. Should have thought about it before you took my Martha's ring and laughed about her death. The Mexican boy suddenly stood up from behind the overturned table, his hands raised high, tears streaming down his young face. Por favor, senor. Please. I am sorry. We are sorry. We did not know. We give everything back, everything. Samuel studied the boy's face, seeing genuine remorse and terror in those dark eyes. How old are you, son? 17, senor. My family, they need money. I thought it would be easy. Rob, old man. Take horses, sell them. I did not know about your wife. I am sorry. Samuel's expression softened slightly as he looked at the terrified youth. You got one chance to live through this, boy. Walk out that door and never look back. Change your life. Find honest work. Forget you ever rode with these men. You understand me? Si, senor. Yes. Thank you. Gracias. The boy stumbled toward the door, not looking back, understanding that he had just received a gift more precious than gold. That left only Morrison, wounded and alone behind his overturned table, the last survivor of a gang that had awakened a legend they should have left sleeping. Samuel approached the makeshift barricade with his guns drawn, his pale eyes showing no mercy for the man who had destroyed his peace and desecrated his wife's memory. Morrison's voice was barely a whisper now, all bluster and cruelty drained away by the reality of facing his own death. The ring, Hayes. It's in my pocket. Take it. Take everything. Just let me live. Samuel's response came with the finality of Judgment Day itself. Some things can't be bought, Morrison. Some debts can only be paid in blood. You should have thought about that before you touched what was sacred to me. Morrison's breathing came in ragged gasps as Samuel approached the overturned table that served as his final refuge. The big man's shirt was soaked with blood from the bullet that had punched through the wooden barrier and found flesh beneath. His gun lay beside him, dropped when the impact had numbed his fingers and stolen his strength. Samuel stood over the wounded gang leader with his matched Colt steady in his hands, pale eyes showing no trace of mercy for the man who had stolen his peace and mocked his wife's memory. Morrison looked up at him with the desperate expression of a predator suddenly understanding what it felt like to be prey. The ring, Hayes, Morrison wheezed, his voice barely audible above his labored breathing. It's in my vest pocket, left side. Real gold, just like you said. Never meant no disrespect to your woman. Was just business, you understand. Just business. Samuel's voice carried the cold finality of a winter wind. Business doesn't include desecrating a dead woman's memory or destroying her belongings for amusement. You crossed a line that no amount of money or apology can uncross. Morrison's hand trembled as he reached slowly toward his vest pocket, every movement carefully watched by the man standing above him. His fingers fumbled with the fabric before producing a small golden band that caught the lamplight filtering through the saloon's smoke-stained windows. Martha's wedding ring, simple and pure, untarnished despite its ordeal. Here, Morrison gasped, extending the ring towards Samuel with shaking fingers. Take it. Take everything. My men and me. We'll leave this territory, never come back. You got my word on that. Samuel reached down and lifted the ring from Morrison's palm, his touch gentle as he examined the precious circlet that had graced his wife's finger for 7 years of happiness. The gold was warm against his skin, unmarked by its theft, carrying with it memories of better days when love had seemed stronger than violence, and peace had felt permanent. "Your word," Samuel said quietly, slipping the ring into his shirt pocket where it would rest next to the fragment of Martha's broken photograph. "The word of a man who makes his living robbing and terrorizing innocent people. The word of a man who laughed about my wife's death like it was some kind of entertainment." Morrison's eyes darted frantically around the ruined saloon, seeking escape routes that no longer existed, hoping for rescue that would never come. The other patrons had long since fled into the afternoon heat, leaving only death and judgment in the smoky interior. Even the bartender had abandoned his post, understanding that some confrontations were too dangerous for witnesses. "Please, Hayes," Morrison whispered, blood beginning to foam at the corners of his mouth. "I got money saved up, hidden away. Enough to buy a spread twice the size of yours. You can have it all. Every last dollar. Just let me live." Samuel studied Morrison's face with the dispassionate attention of a man who had looked into the eyes of 47 dying men and seen every variation of fear, rage, and desperation that the human soul could produce. This was different, though. This wasn't a lawman's duty or a marshal's responsibility. This was personal justice for crimes that went beyond mere robbery. "You took something that can't be replaced with money," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of 12 years of grief. "You destroyed the only things I had left of the woman I loved. You turned her memory into a joke for your amusement. Some debts require payment in blood." Morrison made one final desperate attempt to save his life, his hand sweeping toward a hidden knife in his boot with the last of his failing strength. The movement was clumsy, telegraphed, the desperate act of a dying man who had nothing left to lose. Samuel's right-hand Colt spoke once, the bullet finding Morrison's heart with the surgical precision that had made death's door haze a legend across 3 territories. The big man's body jerked once and lay still, his expression fixed in the permanent surprise of a predator who had finally encountered something more dangerous than himself. Samuel stood over the corpse for a long moment, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret, only the empty completion of a task that should never have been necessary. The saloon fell silent except for the soft moaning of Willie, who still knelt beside the wall clutching his mangled hand. The young man looked up at Samuel with eyes wide with terror and pain, understanding that his fate now hung in the balance of a man who had just demonstrated exactly why his reputation had grown to legendary proportions. Samuel holstered his guns and turned his attention to the surviving gang members. Willie, the heavy-set man with the shoulder wound, and the scar-faced man who had taken a bullet through the leg all waited in terrified silence for the final judgment that would determine whether they lived or died. "You 3 have a choice," Samuel said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who had delivered justice across the frontier for more than a decade. "You can ride out of this territory today and never come back, or you can join your friends in whatever hell awaits men who make their living through violence and theft." Willie nodded frantically, tears streaming down his young face as he struggled to speak through his pain. "We'll go, Mr. Hayes. We'll go today and never come back. You got our word on that?" "Swear to God, we learned our lesson." Samuel's pale eyes moved to each man in turn, reading their faces with the experience of someone who had learned to distinguish between genuine repentance and desperate lies. What he saw in their expressions was pure terror mixed with the kind of understanding that came when violent men finally encountered consequences for their actions. "Take your horses and ride south," Samuel said finally. "Don't stop until you're out of Montana territory. If I ever hear of any of you operating north of the Colorado border, I'll come looking, and next time there won't be any conversation about second chances." The 3 wounded men struggled to their feet, supporting each other as they stumbled toward the saloon's entrance. Willie paused at the door, looking back at Samuel with something approaching gratitude mixed with his terror. "Mr. Hayes," he said quietly, "what should we tell people about what happened here?" Samuel's reply came without hesitation. "Tell them that some men should be left alone to grieve in peace. Tell them that stealing from the wrong person can cost more than money or freedom. Tell them that death's door haze came out of retirement one last time." The wounded men disappeared into the afternoon sunlight, leaving Samuel alone with the bodies of Morrison and Tex and the wreckage of what had once been Hannigan's Rest. The bartender eventually emerged from his hiding place, surveying the damage with the resigned expression of a man who had seen saloon fights before but never anything quite like this. "I'll need to send word to the territorial marshal's office," the bartender said nervously. "Report what happened here. You understand that, Mr. Hayes?" Samuel nodded once, understanding the requirements of frontier law even in retirement. "Tell them Samuel Hayes acted in recovery of stolen property and self-defense against armed robbers. Tell them the deceased were members of the Morrison gang, wanted for robbery and assault across 3 counties. The marshal's office will find that information accurate." He walked to Morrison's body and began the methodical process of recovering his stolen property. The money was in the gang leader's saddlebags, along with items taken from other victims who would never know their belongings had been found. Samuel took only what belonged to him, leaving the rest for the territorial authorities to sort through. The ride back to his ranch took the rest of the day, Samuel leading his 3 recovered horses through country that had seemed threatening that morning but now felt peaceful again. The animals recognized their home range, quickening their pace as familiar landmarks came into view. By sunset, they were back in their own corral, drinking from their own trough, settling into routines that theft and violence had temporarily interrupted. Samuel spent the evening hours with pick and shovel, preparing graves in a section of his property that had never been intended for such purposes. The work was hard and methodical, each shovelful of earth requiring effort from muscles that had not performed such labor in years. But this was necessary work, the kind of cleanup that followed when legends emerged from retirement to settle old debts. Morrison's body went into the deepest grave, 6 feet down in rocky soil that would discourage scavengers. Tex received similar treatment, his horse trading expertise buried alongside his crimes. Samuel worked by lantern light when darkness fell, understanding that some tasks could not wait for convenient timing. He carved no markers for these graves, erected no monuments to mark their locations. This section of his property would appear undisturbed to casual observation, showing only the natural contours of Montana grassland. But Samuel would remember every detail of their placement, just as he remembered the locations of unmarked graves on a dozen different properties across 3 territories. By midnight, the work was finished and the evidence of violence had been erased from his peaceful valley. Samuel cleaned his tools and stored them in the barn, then walked to the small cemetery where Martha's grave rested beneath a simple headstone that bore only her name and dates. The moonlight illuminated the carved inscription as Samuel knelt beside the grave that had anchored his heart for 12 years. Martha Elizabeth Hayes, 1845 to 1881, beloved wife and light of my life. Simple words that carried the weight of a love that had transformed a legendary killer into a peaceful rancher, if only temporarily. Samuel withdrew the recovered wedding ring from his shirt pocket and placed it gently on top of the headstone, positioning it where moonlight would make the gold gleam against dark stone. "Martha," he said quietly, addressing the woman who had given him 7 years of happiness in a life otherwise defined by violence and loss. "I got your ring back. Had to become the man I used to be for a while, but it's done now. They won't hurt anyone else." The night wind rustled through the cottonwood trees that surrounded the small cemetery, carrying with it the scents of grass and wildflowers and the promise of peaceful days ahead. Samuel remained kneeling beside his wife's grave for a long time, remembering better days when love had seemed stronger than violence and the future had held promise instead of loneliness. When he finally rose and walked back toward his house, the gun belt still hung around his waist. Unlike 12 years ago, when he had buried his weapons and tried to bury his past along with them, Samuel understood now that some things could never be permanently laid to rest. Peace was a luxury that had to be defended, and some men carried the responsibility of defense whether they wanted it or not. Inside his house, Samuel began the process of cleaning up the destruction left by Morrison's gang. Broken furniture could be repaired or replaced. Scattered belongings could be gathered and organized. The violated space could be restored to something approaching its former peace. But the innocence was gone forever, destroyed as thoroughly as Martha's photograph and as permanently as the men now buried in unmarked graves on his property. The matched Colts went into a new hiding place, not buried this time, but kept within easy reach. Samuel had learned the lesson that peace without the means to defend it was merely an invitation for predators to do as they pleased. The guns would remain accessible, ready for the day when other violent men made the mistake of underestimating a quiet rancher living alone with his memories. In the days that followed, Samuel resumed his simple routines with one significant difference. His horses grazed safely in their pasture, but now they shared the property with unmarked graves that served as silent monuments to the consequences of crossing certain lines. Travelers who passed through the valley would see only a modest ranch where an aging man worked his small spread in peaceful isolation. They would never know that this peaceful valley had become the final resting place for men who had chosen violence over honest work, theft over legitimate trade, cruelty over simple human decency. They would never suspect that the quiet rancher watching them from his porch had once been the most feared lawman in 3 territories, or that his retirement from violence was conditional rather than permanent. The territorial marshal's office eventually sent a deputy to investigate the events at Hannigan's Rest, but Samuel's version of events matched the physical evidence and witness statements perfectly. Morrison and his gang had been wanted men with long records of robbery and violence. Their deaths at the hands of Samuel Hayes could be officially classified as justifiable homicide in defense of property and person. Word of the confrontation spread through the territory with the speed that legends always traveled in frontier country. The story grew in the telling, as such stories always did, until fact became legend and legend became myth. Some versions had Samuel facing twice as many men. Others described supernatural speed and accuracy that defied human limitations. But the core truth remained consistent across all versions. Death's Door Hayes had come out of retirement one final time, and the men who had forced that return were no longer a threat to anyone. Samuel read the newspaper accounts with detached interest, understanding that his brief return to violence had restored a reputation that would now protect him better than isolation ever could. Years passed, and Samuel Hayes aged into true old age on his Montana ranch. He worked his small spread, tended his horses, and maintained the peaceful routines that had defined his retirement before Morrison's gang had shattered that tranquility. Visitors were rare, but those who did pass through his valley treated the aging rancher with respectful deference, understanding without being told that this was not a man to be trifled with. Samuel's property became known throughout the territory for an unusual characteristic that puzzled travelers and neighbors alike. Unlike most frontier ranches, where the graves of family members and lost travelers marked the passage of time, the Hayes spread showed no evidence of burials or memorials. People joked that it must be the only ranch in Montana with no trespassers' graves, a place so peaceful that even death seemed to pass it by. They never knew how accurate their observation really was. Samuel's ranch indeed had no trespassers' graves, because every man who had ever trespassed with violent intent had been buried in unmarked locations where their presence would never disturb the peace they had tried to destroy. The quiet rancher who worked his land alone carried the secret of their fate as quietly as he carried all the other secrets of a lifetime spent balancing justice and mercy on the edge of a gun. If you enjoyed this tale of frontier justice and the price of underestimating quiet men, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of the American West. We bring you tales of courage, redemption, and the eternal struggle between law and lawlessness every week. Until next time, remember that some men earn their peace through strength, and some graves are better left unmarked.